When we collect this proprietary data, we can often see in the data that there's opportunities for new products to be developed. This is a concept that we based on that's called the digital twin. Once you can build in analytics into the product, you can understand how the customers use your product and what they use your product for.
This is the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell & Associates, a Newport Beach, California-based ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. The ERP OCJ seeks to share expertise, insight, experience, and research, and to create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success. And now, here's your ERP expert and host, the founder of Nestell & Associates, Dr. Jack Nestell.
Hello everyone, Jack here. Today we have a special guest who's an expert in private equity, value creation, and digital transformation. Today's guest joins us to shed light on how private equity firms can leverage digital transformation to unlock unprecedented growth and success. Joining us today is Bruce Sinclair, a seasoned professional with a 30-year career spanning mathematics, science, high technology, business, and investment. He is currently the managing partner at Digital Operating Partners, a specialized consultancy for private equity. Bruce has been a thought leader and an influencer in digital transformation space and is the author of The Private Equity Digital Operating Partner. Joining us from San Francisco Bay Area, Bruce, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jack, I appreciate being on your show.
Yeah, likewise. We really appreciate you being with us today, and I'm really looking forward to sharing out some of your great insight here for our listeners. But before we get started, Bruce, can you tell us more about yourself, further introduce yourself to our listeners?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, like you said, I started out way back when as a mathematician and was a professional programmer for a little while, really loved it, but moved into business on the product marketing side. And this was in software businesses. And in product marketing, my career actually started in visual effects and movies and TV shows and video games. So not meaning in particular, that was when 3D graphics were starting to move into games. They already were. For example, our software was used in Jurassic Park in the first times where there was a digital creature that you could consider a starring actor. And that was the area that I kind of cut my teeth on the business side, the technical side, and from product marketing after the company I worked for was acquired, I kind of moved on more on the brand marketing side and kind of like the fluffy stuff as opposed to the hardcore stuff. And that was fun. And that was with a company called Avid, and they were doing video editing. So not only did they do special effects software when they bought our company, which was Softimage from Microsoft, they did video editing. And from there, after another acquisition, I was able to leave and go on my own. And I was the founder initially of a startup, and then I was the CEO of a number of different software companies, including artificial intelligence company. And that was great and was really good from an educational perspective. And also I really loved it. But at one point I just decided I was looking for something where I had very few reports and I didn't have very many bosses. And so I went into consulting. And that's where my initial venture into consulting was with IoT Inc. And that was when Internet of Things was really starting to come in a big way. And then actually my first book is called IoT Inc. It was published by McGraw-Hill. And that was where I started my consulting. And I think I was doing consulting for maybe about 5, 6, 7 years when I was approached by a private equity firm, and they're our client. And they were in the process of raising a debut $1.5 billion fund. And I joined them as an operating partner, and hence the name Digital Operating Partner. And in the end, there wasn't enough business because very specifically, maybe we'll get into it, the type of companies I help are very specific. And so I left and then recreated IoT Inc., but in the form of Digital Operating Partner. And we're a fractional operating partner organization, but we specifically focus on, as you said, it was digital transformation, but I can get into details a little bit more, but specifically high technology digital transformation. So using proprietary data, which is generally going to be gathered by the Internet of Things. So it's going to be sensors and instrumented, and then using artificial intelligence, data science to interpret that data, and that's where the value is created. The value that we create is for more traditional companies. So I don't work with software companies, although having said that, I have client as an artificial intelligence software company. So okay, so I guess I do. But generally, the focus is on old school companies, and these are in the industrial sector, in the infrastructure sector, in the manufacturing sector, and it could be a bit in the real estate sector. I've done something in the farming, and some in the farming sector as well, the agriculture sector. Um, and what we do is we take these companies, we then instrument where the value is being created for them, for their customers, and then we use that data, that proprietary data, and that's very key, is the proprietary data comes off of whether that's going to be an internal system or that's going to be a product that they develop and then they sell, again, old products, and then use the high technology, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence are the two core ones, to then take that data and create value. And that value, it really depends on where we're going, but that's at a high level. That's kind of what I do today.
Well, thank you, Bruce. I'm really excited to have you on today because your background certainly demonstrates your extensive expertise in private equity value creation and certainly digital transformation. And I'm confident with your wealth of experience, your insights will prove highly valuable as we explore these critical aspects in depth. And you're right, there's some areas there that you touched on that I'd like to dig into a little bit here and share out with our listeners. Listeners, all of us here at the ERP OCJ hope you find this podcast useful as we share lessons learned, discover best practices, and explore the human element components of ERP organizational change. Please stay with us till the end. Bruce will give us his actionable golden nugget of advice based on today's conversation, and I will recap our key discoveries and offer my suggestions on how to implement what we've learned. Our conversations here are built around the listen and learn approach. It's when you apply what you've learned that you will begin to move the needle forward. So let's dive in. So, Bruce, my first question for you is, could you further explain what smart digital transformation means in the context of private equity and why it's more than just IT and digital marketing?
Yes. So the way I kind of look at, I mean, if you think of digital transformation, it's such an overused term that it almost has lost its meaning. And particularly in private equity, when we talk digital, often what I'll get back is, oh, that's IT, and that is a type of digital transformation, no doubt. If you're moving a payroll system from, and again, I'll go old school, from some QuickBooks or something like that to something more sophisticated, or even something even less sophisticated than QuickBook, that is a transformation, and digital is part of it. But I kind of look at digital transformation in three different layers. The first layer is that IT and the ERP layer. And the second layer, I look at it as, let's say, robotics and RPA systems, where this is really just RPA systems are kind of like robots, but they're soft robots, and they click on interfaces. And so this is kind of, let's say the first one is more the infrastructure level. The second layer is more the, let's say, the operations layer. And then the smart layer, this is the technology, like I was saying before, the two main ones being Internet of Things, artificial intelligence / data science, also augmented reality, let's say 3D printing, things like that. And the difference there, if from a smart perspective, is the concept of using proprietary data, as I mentioned earlier. And that's really the key for everyone listening, is that if you think about your company, or if you think about a portfolio company, there's going to be data in that company that can be used to create value. It's really as simple as that. And where I focus more is not so much on the operations layer, as I was saying before, but more on, so for manufacturing, as an example, you might have heard of, listeners, you may have heard of Industry 4.0 or Industrial Internet of Things. And that's the process of using data, again, for efficiency. So now if we start looking at value creation, we can look at the three different areas of value creation. The first one being revenue growth, and that breaks down in about 5 different areas, if you like, of how I kind of look at a company. The second one is margin. And the reason I bring that up is in manufacturing, that's what you're doing. You're trying to improve the margins, and you're using technology to make things more efficient. And then the third one, where I help these, let's say, old school companies, is on the valuation models. A few different areas that you can garner, you can ratchet up the valuation multiple, which is very important when you're thinking about selling it, whether you're selling to a private sponsor. But it's the process of, well, literally transforming a company that is really analog, let's call it analog. Let's say that they make things made out of metal, which a number of clients do, big metal, pounded in this place by hand. Sometimes it's manufactured with different machines. But in that area, if you transform the company, and generally the process is just at a very high level, come up with a digital investment thesis, come up with a digital transformation plan, execute that digital transformation plan, and then prepare for exit. But if you look at the exit multiple, generally what we're doing is we're creating structural changes within the company and changing them from bending metal companies to companies that now incorporate software engineers and incorporate data scientists with the organization. And those structural changes, among others, another one is the digital, which comes from just being more like a digital. When you start looking at comps, when you're selling the company. So where I focus mostly though on is not on margins, although we can do margins, but I believe there's a heck of a lot more opportunity when we start looking at revenue and then what I just mentioned on valuation multiple. And so for the revenue, this can come in a number of different ways, but it all comes again from proprietary data. So that can be from innovation. And so this is going to market share expansion. So if you have a more innovative product, you're using digital, that would be one example. There's customer expansion. There's market expansion, as I was saying. There's pricing. There's around 5 different areas that we focus on, and we kind of look at each of those areas. But at a high level, again, when we go back to the digital transformation, what I think separates it from, let's say, the infrastructure and the operational is that we're using this data, we're transforming it into useful information. Generally, I'm focused on the product. And that product can be infrastructure. It could be operating that product. It could be selling that product. So yeah, I don't know if that's clear enough. That's kind of the differentiation, at least in how I approach digital transformation.
Yeah, that's great, Bruce. I appreciate it. And you touch on some ideas that a lot of folks or firms don't think about in the context of digital transformation, and they should, right? Like as you'd mentioned, margins, evaluation multiple, digital investment thesis, looking at the comps, exit multiple, revenue from proprietary data. I mean, those are great ideas to be sure. So as you'd mentioned in your intro, Bruce, you were a key player in an AI startup. You wrote a book on IoT. So, and this is kind of a general higher level question, but how can private equity firms leverage high technologies like AI and IoT to create meaningful business value within their portfolio companies? What would you have to say to that? That's one question that we get frequently, and I'm curious what your response would be to that one.
So yeah, at a very high level, we do the same thing as when a P firm is purchasing a company. They're going to come up with their investment thesis and they're going to look at creation levers. Similarly, what we do is we come up with a digital investment thesis. And that digital investment thesis, I can get into the nuts and bolts, but what we're doing is very familiar. We're looking at customer retention. Is there a way that we can apply technology to the overall lifetime value of the customer? We're looking at how do we expand market share, as I was mentioned before. That's generally going to be innovation. So that's going to be making what you sell better, so that you get more market share. We look at customer expansion as well, and that is how do we sell more to our existing customers. And that can be through. I'm a big fan of service business and connecting the data that we get from the products to generating high margin service business. Consumables also is an area where we can do it. But just keeping on rattling it off, product expansion is when we collect this proprietary data, we can often see in the data that there's opportunities for new products to be developed. And so this is a concept that we based on that's called the digital twin. Once you can build in analytics into the product, you can understand how the customers use your product and what they use your product for. So that's a usability model. These are artificial intelligence models that we incorporate in almost every single engagement that we do. And then there's pricing optimization. So, everything I've mentioned here, pricing optimization, when you can understand how your customer is using your product and how they're making money from using your product. So this is now, I haven't really talked about business models, but business models is an area also of value creation. So answering your question, how do we create value? But when we can understand how our customers, and our customers, when I say our customers, I mean our portfolio companies, how they are making money, we can then quantify the value that we are providing our customers to make their money. And once we can quantify the value that we produce to have our customers make their money, if you're following the chain of events, then we can really
Yep.
we can now price our products, and this can be a service as well. And generally they are services and getting into the business model. But generally when we can understand, when we can quantify, and this is why I keep on mentioning proprietary data, but when we can quantify how our customers are making money with our product, again, the portfolio company's product, we can then price it very accurately. So, you have got cost plus pricing, and of course, there's many firms that many of your listeners may use for pricing that are focused, strictly on finding the right price. But when you have the data for how the customers are making, then you can price it very, very accurately, and that becomes a value. And then moving into the business model side, and I haven't touched or the exit model, but these are all the ways how we do it. But I'm still going high level just to say that we do the exact same thing. But now we start getting into somewhere where we maybe diverge, whereas you might have an operating partner for pricing. You might have an operating partner that has really good marketing experience. And so you can try to expand your market share just through marketing, not necessarily innovation. But when we can understand the business model of our customers, we can invert our business model, and again, the business model of the portfolio. We can invert our business model, or we can create a whole different business model that interfaces with their business. And there's in my first book, if anyone wants to get into detail, there's really five, I believe pretty much every single business model for these five business models. But we can move through the various different business models to provide one that is a win-win, in the sense that the customer, since we're quantifying the value that we produce, and that's very important that you quantify the value. It's not just, it's going to be better and it's going to be more valuable. It's going to be more value by this amount, and it's going to provide this much value to your customers. But once we can do that, we can build a business model that interfaces with theirs such that it's a win-win. So let me give you the most basic business model is a one and done product sale. So we'll use Teslas. So you buy a Tesla, pay your money, and it's done. Now, it's a little different with Tesla, and it's a little different in the products that other companies, in that what we do, unlike GM is catching on them, but unlike old school car manufacturer, once the sale is made, and in fact, you don't even make the sale, it's done through a distribution network, and so you don't even know practically who the customer is. But Tesla, and that being a smart car, and then we can now apply the adjective smart to product. So if you're listening, what does your company do? We can add smart to it. What's your portfolio companies do? We can add smart to that service or two. But what they're doing initially in that initial business model is not only is selling it traditional, but they have this tethered connection through, again, this proprietary data, and this data is generally gathered from the Internet of Things. But there is a connection between Tesla and the customer, and Tesla and the product. And so, for example, we move into the next business model, and I can go more, but for the number 2 business model, this is a product and a service business model. And that is where you buy the product, but then there's an ongoing service that you can sell. This can be an information service. This can be, as I was saying, an actual practical service where you're turning wrenches. But Tesla does this, and I'll give an example. One of the things I really is fintech, because you can insure products. Once you understand how the product, remember I mentioned the usability and utility model. Once we understand how the customer uses the product, we can then insure that product in a way that's profitable, very profitable for us, and probably lower cost to the customer. As an example, Tesla now is going to be offering car insurance. Now, my daughter, who would be demographically she's now in her 20s, but when she was a teen, I remember when they were both on the payroll, I was paying for their car insurance. As my son, I have a son who's a couple of years than my daughter. Now, my daughter was the worst driver in the world. She was a speed demon. She got into a couple accidents, including with my car, her car. Where on the other side, my son, he drove like an old lady, but their insurance premiums. My son's premium was almost double. So this is an example of a product service business model where one type of service, and there could be many others, but for continuing analogy or example, would be car insurance. And if you know how and this is going back to what I mentioned earlier, when you have proprietary data and you have that connection between you and the customer's product, you can then gather information for a variety of different reasons, but one of them is to sell services. So that would be a product service business model. And the next step beyond that would be a service business model. And I guess we'll use the car example. That would be one service business model for a car would be you pay for how many miles you drive it. Now, it could be like a lease where you pay for how many months you drive it. So that's just the time dimension. So the pivot variable there is the time dimension. But you could do a number of miles driven. So if you think about an industrial product, let's say it's a wood chipper. I'm just making this up. You could introduce, you being the portfolio company, you could introduce a business model that says, we're going to own this wood chipper, but we're going to let you have it. And the business model will be the more you use the wood chipper, the more you will pay us. And implied in that is if you're using the wood chipper, you're making money from using that wood chipper. So that's an example of a win-win and a different type of business model, let's say, than a traditional company would consider, like a wood chipper, because they don't have that proprietary data that I was talking about earlier. So how do we make money for these companies is really at a high level the exact same way that private equity firms make money for these companies today. Maybe not so much on the business model, but a little bit on the business model. But we use the digital technology and again, this data, this proprietary data to then translate into value. So that would be my long-winded answer to that question.
Good stuff. No, thank you, Bruce. I would like to ask you more about the role of the digital operating partner. And in fact, as you'd mentioned earlier, you wrote a book called The Private Equity Digital Operating Partner, and we'll include links to that in our show notes. But could you tell our listeners more about the concept and how it can benefit private equity firms? And Bruce, I think you would admit it's not exactly every day, every private equity firm where they have a digital operating partner. So could you tell us more about that concept and its benefit to PE firms?
Sure. And it's true that there's very few firms that do have digital partners. The concept is, again, just the same as an operating partner. That operating partner might be a supply chain expert. They would look at each of the companies and the type of companies that the firm would purchase would generally, if they have a supply chain expert, it means that that's kind of the niche that they're focused on. And so for each of the portfolio companies, this operating partner would look at the company and try to find a proprietary and create value with their expertise in this example, supply chain. In our example, the digital operating partner, we don't do IT, we don't do ERP, that middle area either. We don't. But what we do is we look at a company and we look for a proprietary angle that feeds into the digital investment thesis. And we try to understand, with all these levers that we have at our disposal, how do we create value? So the concept of digital operating partners and having a fractional digital owner is that it's just it doesn't replace the existing operational improvement team or value creation team, what it's called. Or maybe you don't even have a team, but what it's meant to do is to look at deals, if that's close, or look at companies post-close and try to identify where can we create value by using, at a core, again, the Internet of Things. So we put sensors on things, and then artificial intelligence or data science in some cases. And how do we create value? So it's just a very focused expertise on digital technology and then marrying that with the understanding of private equity, but looking at how do we create an investment thesis strictly on digital. And we model this as well. If you're going to put in $1, what are you going to get back in terms of the return on investment? So it's really high level, the exact same thing as any other operating partner, except for, in this case, it's not in-house. You're using it because maybe not all your fit the characteristics of how I could help, how digital operating partners can help. So it's bringing in an operating partner that, whether it's myself or someone else on my team, that has high experience and potentially, hopefully, at a very high level, the sector as well, because there is importance on the sector and in particular how things work. But it's just bringing in an expert that looks at a deal with a different eye. And sometimes this is looked at before close, so diligence. They want to maybe have a little bit more conviction on the price, and so they may price the deal at how they currently do it, and then they may they may tap us to say, okay, we're thinking, and they're not going to give us the numbers, obviously, but we're thinking this is something we're interested in. Where do you see some extra value? And then we can look at, in the case of diligence, we can look at the company and say, look, we think that these are the four main areas where we create value. Very roughly, this is what we think the return on the technology investment would be. And then the buyer can then use that to maybe up their bid, because often these are not proprietary deal auctions, and that just gives them a little bit more conviction about it. So yeah, high level, it's the same as any other operating partner, except for the expertise has been the stuff I've been speaking about up until now.
Bruce, what would you say, or what are the specific or the most common challenges do private equity firms face when it comes to digital transformation, based on your experience?
It's just awareness. I think there's awareness now, from even a year before, there was like very little awareness. People have heard AI and this and that, but at least now there's a little bit more awareness. But I would say that's the biggest challenge, is still awareness that there is, this is just another tool, just another tool in the PE firm's arsenal to be able to create value. But there is another way of creating value for certain types of companies. And so most of the challenges is really just awareness and not knowing that it's there. Once I engage with a PE firm and we start talking the language that they understand, and that goes back to the creation techniques, but just using digital instead, it all clicks in. It all comes down to the same thing. Effectively, is if we take $1 of money that comes from the portfolio, can we invest it? What's the best way that we can invest that? And so what I propose to the companies I work with is do that with all the different value creation techniques, do it with digital, and then base it on the return on investment. And it really just comes down to that. So yeah, I think it all comes down, in my view. I love the technology. As you heard, I'm a nerd originally, but what I like is value creation even more. And even more than that, I like quantify it's being created so that our customers, that being the PE firms, a leg up at the beginning or in the middle, and then specifically on exit. Because the nice thing is, there's always there's always let's say, a roadmap. And so once you've started the structural changes, you've identified the roadmap. So whether that's going to be another sponsor that's going to or sell to a strategic, there's lots of work to do on exit as well. I can just leave it at that.
So, Bruce, just to drill a little deeper there, you mentioned earlier how you utilize modeling in a previous answer. You talked about this idea of modeling. Can you walk our listeners through the value discovery process that Digital Operating Partners uses, or in your book, uses to identify untapped value within portfolio companies? And how does that tie into this idea that you've described previously with proprietary data? Can you walk us through that process of value discovery a little deeper?
Sure. So let's talk about a few different types of models. So the first thing is, everyone should be aware, and is sometimes isn't as clear in the popular media, but artificial intelligence, data science are based on models. So effectively, what you're building a model, you take a certain amount of data, it can be a subset of that you have in hand, and you build a model. And then you improve that model over time and use this model to approximate reality. And so in a lot of cases, the models that we build are a digital twin. And then what we're doing is we're simulating the way that this wood chipper, as an example, works. The second type of model is, so I'm not sure which one you're referring to, but the model is we modeling our return on technology investment. And so that's looking at the company structure, that's looking at margins, that's looking at where we think we can improve revenue growth, where we think we can improve margin, and then how we think that we the exit multiple. And each of these we model as well in terms of how does it impact valuation. So at the end of the day, we're going to be looking at EBITDA and at how does revenue growth and margin in EBITDA, and then we're going to look at how does what we're expand the exit multiple. So that's a very high level. How the process that we look at is kind of based on a playbook that I've developed before that. It was similar, but maybe called different names. But there's a playbook that we kind of go through. That's almost like before a flight takes off, the pilots go through a checklist. And so what we have is a very broad checklist that's been based on the last 7 years or so of our experience. And we kind of just, in a very numb way, go through each one of those and then try to project it onto the company, the portfolio company. And then it's kind of like, let's say, a bottoms up approach. So we're making sure we're not missing anything. The top down approach is generally going to be, it's going to come from imagination. And this is really looking at this wood chipper, going back to that example, and seeing, wow, what I really see here, and I'm just making this up, is wood chipper insurance is super expensive. Here's an opportunity for product expansion for this wood chipper firm. Let's build in a model. In this case, it's how does the wood chipper used and what's it used for? Let's build in a model, going back to what I was saying, for creating insurance and then being able to price and underwrite that insurance, and the company can underwrite an institution. But in any case, at a top level, you might just be using your imagination and just looking at the market dynamics. What sector is the company in? What are the competitors of this company? And then what are the macro dynamics of that industry? And what we're looking for in all cases is going to be some tailwinds that will only improve over time. And so that's kind of the top down approach, is just using experience, using your experience and your imagination to say, and then looking at the sector, looking at the competitive space. It could be, for example, how are they losing against their next best competitor? So it sounds pretty thorough a little bit, because it is, in the sense that it's really just looking at the situation, using experience and using imagination to create an investment thesis. The other way where I started is using the playbook, and that's just a brain dead approach of just going through one thing after another to make sure that when you were doing that top down, you didn't miss anything. So that's the approach.
Sure.
That's the approach that
Yeah. Well, good stuff. Thanks, Bruce. Bruce, as a digital transformation thought leader, what future trends do you see emerging in the private equity digital transformation space in particular? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been doing it for a while. I was the CEO of an AI company, but the trend is AI. And I think we've seen this in the last year, Microsoft, big players. But the big trend, the future trend, which is starting just now, is using artificial intelligence for value creation. It's a simple, not necessarily for sourcing deals, not necessarily for looking at what companies to invest in. You could use it for that too, but in this case, it's actually for of the portfolio. And that's been what I was talking about earlier. Now you can have two companies that use AI. Let's say it's off the shelf AI, but the differentiator, I'm going to say it again because I've said it, be a drinking game, it's proprietary data. And so this is really important because I've said it so many times, but the trend is artificial intelligence. But where I really think where to look in terms of value when you're evaluating a company or you're looking at your portfolio companies is what type of data do you have now, and the data would be useful to you. And so, yeah. But the future trend is artificial intelligence and utilizing it to create value.
Super. Thanks, Bruce. So one last question. Again, thank you for your time today, and it was a fun conversation. But I'd like to ask you for your golden nugget. Given all that we've discussed today, could you briefly summarize the key takeaways our listeners should remember? So in other words, based on these insights, what is the single most valuable piece of advice you would offer to our listeners as they navigate their journeys regarding private equity, value creation, and digital transformation?
Well, it's going to be one last drink because I'm going to say the word again, and that's going to be proprietary. So the nugget is for every single company, there's either going to be data that's already there. And I'll use an example. One portfolio company asked, and it was for the transmission of gas. In any case, they had a library, and they had a library literally, let's say, 20 feet by 40 feet full of paper. And that paper was models that they created over the years. It was for the different services that they could produce. And it was for the different parts, for the different models, and so forth. And it was all. Now, that company there is a perfect example where you could use, let's talk about Gen AI, where you take in that data, you ingest that data into a digital form. But one of the challenges that this company had in this particular case, so again, it's not going to be a generic, for every company, but in this particular case, they had a big library of paper data, and then they had a shortage of technicians. And there were a lot of their best technicians were retiring, and they're having a hard time hiring a technician in their place. And so one of the challenges that they had was trying to pass on the tribal knowledge. This is a perfect example where Gen AI can take that data and then can transform it into a model, as we were talking about before. In this case, there'd be different models. We could have the part model. We could have the, let's say, the model, what type of model it was. And then the third one being, which is one I'd like to talk about a little bit more, is just the servicing model. And so you could take this data and at a very high level, you could ingest it, build a servicing model, and then you could have your new service professional query it like, how do I fix this? Or I'm seeing this happen. Now, this is something that generally would take, you'd have to talk to someone super experienced, or you'd go through some sort of relational database, I suppose, if you're more sophisticated, although the clients that are that sophisticated. But this would be an example of proprietary data and where there's a lot of value. In this case, where it is for margin expansion because we provide our services for a lower cost. But yeah, proprietary data would definitely Nugget. Every company either has it or they can produce it by strapping on, let's say, sensors in a very simple way.
Good stuff. Thanks, Bruce. As we wrap up today's episode, I want to emphasize the wealth of insights we've gained from our guests, Bruce and Claire. We dove into the world of private equity, value creation, and digital transformation, and Bruce has shared some invaluable perspectives and strategies, to be sure. Bruce's concept of smart digital transformation in private equity is a game changer, and the digital operating partner approach he discussed has the potential to unlock untapped value within portfolio companies. But remember, knowledge alone is just the first step. It's when you take action and apply what you've learned that you truly move the needle forward. So I encourage all of our listeners, whether you're in private equity or in any other field, to take the insights shared today and put them into practice. Bruce, thank you so much for your time today. I highly recommend your books to our listeners, and we will certainly put those in our show notes. And I really appreciate your dedication to your trade. But before we go, can you tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Digitaloperatingpartners.com is a good place to start. There are plenty of case studies there. You can see what we've done for it. So you can see if there's a fit for you. The other thing is I don't do that often because I'm pretty picky, but I do have the Digital Transformation podcast. If you're interested in maybe getting into a little bit more detail beyond what Jack and I have been speaking about, that's another good one.
Super. Well, thank you, Bruce. Thank you again. Thanks for sharing your experience and insight. Be well, and we'll certainly talk soon.
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the ERP OCJ podcast. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change successes and challenges.